Getting started in watercolor. This video is meant to be a visual guide to the information I give in my suggested materials list. You'll need a palette, paint, brushes, paper, a water container, and a sponge. There's an incredible range of materials available, and no particular material is the right thing to use. The supplies definitely don't make the painter. Personal preference plays a really big role, but if you don't have a lot of experience, how are you supposed to know what you prefer, right? So I'll show you the materials that I personally like to use, and I'll also give you suggestions for an inexpensive setup. If you're just starting out, I would suggest you go for a simple setup first, get some experience with the basics, and then decide what materials you'd actually like to invest in. If you already have some materials, there's probably no need to buy anything new unless you're missing something important. Let me just move this a little bit so you can see. So let's start with paints. There are a lot of good brands of paint out there. The ones I use the most are professional grades of paint. I like M. Graham, which is a relatively affordable professional grade. Daniel Smith, Winsor & Newton, which comes in multiple sizes, as do some of the others. And I also am okay with the American Journey made by Cheap Joe's Art Supply. It's a really decent paint too, and it's a little less expensive than some of the other options. I've ended up with certain preferences, one brand's color over another brand's color, but you know, there's no one right material to use. Any of these are good, and there's other brands that are really great too. If you're just starting out, the paints I would suggest that I like to use are these Grumbacher Academy. There's also a Cotman brand that has a student grade paint. These are really nice, the same gooey consistency, rich colors that you get in some of the professional grades. You can tell a difference, but it's not a super significant difference. Some of the tube watercolors out there really aren't that great. These are really decent. I don't mind working with them. They have a nice consistency and they cost significantly less than the professional grade brands. These are a good place to start. And for some people, even to stay here, depending on what your purpose is, these might be just fine for what you're wanting to do. So I start with suggesting a pretty simple palette. You're going to want red, yellow, and blue, a warm and cool version of each, and I explain what the warm and cool primaries are in my video about color basics. You will need a good dark pigment as well, something like a neutral tint, indigo, or Payne's Gray. If you already have paints and they include these, then you don't need anything new. There aren't specific colors that I think you really absolutely have to have. If you don't already have paints and are looking for suggestions on which to buy, I'll have information on my suggested materials list that I will post someplace near this video. Something to keep in mind with paints is that there isn't a consistency between color names. So one brand's sap green could be completely different than another brand's sap green. There's no regulation about the color names. So if you have a color that you like and you're switching brands, you want to make sure you get the same thing. What you're looking for is the pigment number. I don't know if you can quite see this. Right in here it says PB29. So if I look on the back of another tube of paint that's called French Ultramarine and it says PB29, it's going to look the same. If it has a different color code, it might look close, but it's not going to be the exact same color. It's kind of a pain, but something to keep in mind. Let's see, what's next? Palette. So if you have paint, you need a place to put it, right? My personal preference is this John Pike palette, which comes with a lid, which is lovely. It doesn't seal, so if it's wet in there and you tip it, it will drip. But this gives two really nice big mixing surfaces. You can even squirt out some extra paint in your lid and use that as additional palette space even if you want. I like the extra large wells on the John Pike. If I'm using a larger brush, it's really easy to fill that brush with paint. Which is just a really useful thing as you move down the road in your journey with painting here. I would highly suggest choosing a palette of some kind that has these features, the large flat mixing surface and large wells. But depending on what your purpose is in painting, maybe that doesn't suit you. If you're going to be traveling, you might want something a little bit smaller. They make some really great folding palettes that have a gasket around them so that your paints are less likely to leak, say in your luggage. I would still wrap them in plastic bags to be safe. If you're just getting started, another suggestion I would have is to go really inexpensive. This is like a $2 palette. It comes with a lid. Some of them come with a lid, some don't. I have found the lids online. But I can hold 10 different colors, which is more than sufficient to get started. Pretty good size wells. Obviously not quite as big, but you can still get in there with a good size brush. If you go this route, you'll need a separate mixing surface. And a great free option is to save the lids of white plastic food containers. The larger the better. If you're somebody who consumes Cool Whip, those are great lids. Nice flat space. You can have 5 of these sitting out. They're free. They work well. You can also spend some money and buy things that are meant to be mixing trays. Honestly, I find these a little irritating because the wells are so small that people will end up making such a small quantity of paint that they really struggle unless they're painting something smaller, really small, honestly. Once you get into anything of any decent size, you're really going to want larger mixing surface than this offers. But there's lots of different things out there. And what, really doesn't matter. Like I said, these are great. I use these with students all the time. I use them myself sometimes. It's just fine. Brushes. So there are so many brush options out there. I personally prefer synthetics or synthetic blends. What I'm looking for in a brush is something with a firmer spring to it that comes to a really fine point. So I'm looking for, see how this comes to a nice fine point. I think this is brand new, so it's not going to show the spring as well. But something that really feels responsive when you push on. It's not just soft and mushy. If it's soft and mushy, you'll probably get a little frustrated as you're painting. You're going to want a medium size round brush. Something in this range. It's a little hard to see maybe next to my fingers. You can get an idea for the scale of that. This happens to be a number 12. There's no consistency between brush sizes. So one brand's 10, might be another brand's 14. If you find something that you like, if you buy online, you can look at the product description and it will show you the actual measurements and you can compare to what you already have. The other brush I recommend starting with is a 1-inch flat brush. These are the 2 brushes that I used for 90%, 95% or more of my painting. If you're looking for an inexpensive place to start, I have really liked the Blick Scholastic Golden Taklon brushes. They have a pretty good spring. They come to a really nice fine point, and these hold up really well. I use these with student groups and even kids, and they'll last for a couple years, even with kids who really don't treat brushes as well as you might hope. This particular brush is only available at Dick Blick because it's their house brand. Simply Simmons is another brand that makes a pretty good brush that has a nice spring to it and a fine point. And I don't mind if I have to paint with those brushes. They're not my favorite, but they're really, really decent. It would not irritate me to have to use those. You can get less expensive 1-inch brushes as well. I've been using this same 1-inch brush for many years. They don't wear out, at least for me, they don't wear out the same as the round brushes, just the way you wind up using these to make larger shapes. I personally don't end up doing as much scrubbing kinds of things with those. So you're probably okay investing in a mid-range brush like this to start with that will last you for a long time. I do have a good array of different brushes. Like everybody, you wind up buying more stuff because that's just what we do, unfortunately. But really, truly, all you need to get started is that 1-inch flat and a medium round brush. If you really want to have something smaller on hand, that's just fine. If you get a brush with a nice fine point, you're not going to need a smaller brush because you'll be able to do all your small shapes with a light touch. Though, if you're a younger student, or if you're somebody who struggles with a light touch, you might go for a smaller brush just because it does make it a little bit easier to do some small shapes too. Let's see, paper is next. Paper truly is the one place where you can most tell the difference in quality as far as watercolor supplies go. Like I said, there's good student brand or student grade paints available. There's good student grade brushes available. But man, paper is it's just so different. Now that said, there's no need to jump straight to the most expensive professional options. For practice work, the less expensive papers are totally okay. Just be sure that you're using a 140 pound or heavier paper, and you'll be able to find that on the cover of your paper. It should say the weight of the paper. You want 140 or higher. If you're starting with a more beginner paper, you're probably not going to find anything heavier than 140. You will see a lot of 90 pound. Don't go for the 90. Lighter papers ripple and break down a lot faster, which really works against you when you're learning. You will want to upgrade to better paper pretty early on. And you can go back and forth. Save the nicer paper for when you've got a painting that you're really wanting to invest more time in and really hoping that the outcome is good. And go back to the less expensive papers for exercises and things. When you get into more expensive papers, you'll have texture choices too. There's cold press, hot press, and rough. I'd suggest starting with cold press. It's kind of middle of the road. I think most people end up working in cold press, and you can experiment with the others later. If you jump all over the place when you're learning something, it's so much harder to figure out what you're doing with it. The 140 pound papers will warp if you work wet, which it's watercolor, so of course we do. Many artists stretch their paper, which is its own separate skill set, and I will end up making a video to teach that too. If you don't want to have to stretch your paper, you can deal with the warping, or you can look at using 300 pound paper, which is what this happens to be. And I've got tape on here, so it's hard to see, but it's a really thick, almost like a thin cardboard. It will warp far less. You have to get really wet for it to get super warpy. It's also much more expensive. Or another option is to look at a watercolor block. So blocks comes in this kind of booklet. When you open it up, and mine's kind of broken apart because I'm a little hard on my materials, but your pages of paper are glued on the edges. This black stuff is glue, and there's a gap where there isn't glue. And I consider blocks sort of semi-stretched. They're not as stretched as if you actually stretch your own paper. They can still warp. If you paint really wet, you will still get some warping. But they do pretty good. They hold it pretty flat, keeps it in place while you work. When you're done, you're going to use a fingernail or a knife and separate out that top page, and then just run that around all the edges to break the glue for that top page and peel it off, and then you're good to go for another painting. These are really nice for traveling. They make them in all kinds of different sizes, and it's kind of one intact thing. You don't have to bring a board for stretching or anything else. They also make nice sketchbooks that have even 300 pound paper in them, which is lovely if you're somebody who wants to travel and sketch at the same time, or paint and travel. I usually buy full sheets of paper, which are 30 by 22 inches, and then I cut them to size and stretch them. That's the most economical way. It's less expensive per inch to buy a full-size sheet. The Arches, which is what this was, is a great paper. It's a really common favorite paper among professional artists, but there are others. It is pretty expensive. The 300 pound is even more expensive than the 140. There are other options that I like for professional papers. One is called Kilimanjaro, which is a house brand for Cheap Joe's Art Supply. They have the 140 pound and 300 pound. They also have travel sketchbooks that alternate. I think it's a 300 pound, maybe it's a 140 pound, with a sheet of drawing paper, which is really kind of nice if that's what you're going to be doing. And then the other brand I like that I've found is Winsor & Newton has a professional paper that's much less expensive than the Arches and really works well. And they also have the 300 pound, and they sell that in full-size sheets. You can cut it to size. Both those brands work really well. There are lots of others. You can go online, you can look at art supply stores and read reviews. When I say that, look at actual art supply stores like Blick or Cheap Joe's or Jerry's Artorama. Not Michael's so much. They don't have as much of the fine art watercolor papers. Your options will be much more limited. One other option real quick for the block. So I showed you the Arches block. There is a student grade paper that comes in a block. It's called Canson Montval. So this is the Canson brand of paper. This is the logo you'll see on that. Last I checked, it had a black cover. Who knows what it looks like now? That's been some years. But the Canson Montval watercolor block is really decent. It's definitely better than the beginner papers. It holds the paint better than most of those do. And it doesn't break down as fast as the beginner papers, but it definitely breaks down much faster than professional grade if you overwork it, meaning if you're too vigorous with your brush strokes. So it's kind of a nice in-between with a significantly lower price point than some of the others. The other materials you're going to need are a large container for water. It can be a jar, it can be a plastic tub, whatever you prefer, and a large kitchen sponge. And I'll explain the sponge in my watercolor basics video, but trust me that you need this. You want to make sure you get a very large kitchen sponge, just a plain kitchen sponge. So not a natural sponge and not the sponges that you use for drywall or tile work. And I have the dimensions of this written out in my materials list. If all of this is kind of overwhelming, start with a really basic setup. Start with just the small, less expensive palette. Get yourself, save yourself, have your neighbors save you, mixing tray, your student grade paints, student grade brush in those 2 sizes, and some kind of paper. This Canson watercolor works just fine. Strathmore makes a watercolor paper for students that's just fine as well. You'll want to move out of those at some point, but you can start there and that's just fine. That'll get you going. You can find these materials online at a lot of different sites. To make it simple, I've compiled some options into 2 different wish lists on Blick.com. That doesn't mean you need to purchase there, but at least gives you the visual of what you're looking at, and you can compare it to what I showed you here. You definitely don't need everything on those lists. It's just a collection of some of the options. That suggested materials list, I will try to attach it near this video. It's also available on my website, which is www.jessicabryant.com. Thank you and happy painting!